So there is this news in the Telegraph on side pages about Israel bracing itself for tougher measures as revived restrictions fail to stop cases increasing. Now, that is a country where restrictions have failed to stop the virus. What is going on there? And what is the implication for the UK's revived restrictions having an impact? And there is a rare piece from Pakistan. It's a picture of the female students in Peshawar, Pakistan, wear protective masks as they queue to have their temperature checked before entering a class. Under its, within quotation marks, smart lockdown system, the country, that is Pakistan, has started to ease coronavirus restrictions and allowed the reopening of schools for pupils aged 10 to 13. Okay, there is a piece about Uncle Tom. It's Uncle Ben this time, but it's the company in the news is Uncle Ben, who is being retired by the Uncle Ben's rice products manufacturers, Ben's Original, after the manufacturer Mars acknowledged that the logo depicting an elderly African American promoted racial stereotypes. And the revamped brand, which features the same blue font and orange packaging, but without the image of Ben, will hit the shelves in 2021. Fiona Dawson, head of Mars food business, said it's time for him to retire. She said the term uncle had overtones of servility and had sometimes been used disparagingly in America to refer to black men. Clearly, that's sometimes something we would not want to be associated with. It comes as it's a number of things that are being done on the outside by American corporations and similar outfits across the Western countries. And that is in the wake of the murder of the black man by the police. And the black man is the Floyd, the man who was murdered is Floyd. And that actually acknowledgement by Fiona Dawson of uncle having a negative overtone and at the expense of the African American people needs to be brought to the attention of the nephew Tom in Britain, who has been officially the willing servile embodiment of servility, mental servility, and willing mental slavery. Trevor Terrible Phillips. And the main papers today are not running anything new. It's the same shallow performance that they had done in the papers yesterday. And yesterday, the morning scar was running this one. It's a kind of updated take on the scripted spiel by a defiant Margaret Thatcher, who at the height of her defiance against democracy and accountability was overly celebrated for saying the lady is not for turning. Now it seems that Johnson is for turning, and they're not even calling him Johnson. And the Johnson is going away. I mean, there is a subtle indication on the private eye, dated tomorrow, or dated fortnight starting from tomorrow, that he's on his way out. Well, that is the hint, but they're not saying it quite that he's resigning. And the private eye and the morning scar are not the only ones. The entirety of Fleet Street, including the Daily Mail and the Sun and the Star and the Express, have all run negative kind of slogans on the front page. So this is the one that, of course, we showed yesterday, the Daily Mail. And I'll come to the point in a minute about why. And this is the Beaverbrook's legacy of stupidity that looks at any excuse to hail Boris Johnson and associate him with defining our destiny. I mean, how completely outrageously stupid. Boris Johnson has no destiny anywhere about him. He's completely disorganized, dishonest, and is dysfunctional. Even the Boris Graf admitting that difficult months ahead. And of course, the Daily Mirror is talking about his last chance saloon. That is a thing that is saying goodbye there on the second wave. So that's what they're taking it from. Essentially, the papers are continuing the phony business. They're not telling the actual truth about where it starts, how it works, and how it ends. And they're not comparing the various situations. For example, in Israel, they're saying that today's Telegraph is saying that despite the fact that there is tougher lockdowns, the virus is not stopping. It is increasing, still spreading. And so there is no factual, evidential reporting from the ground or from the front line or from the places where the actual details of the treatment, contacts, and all the tests and their outcomes and their effects and effectiveness are being monitored, implemented, carried out, observed, and tested. The test results are, or the test operations are tested. So one of the things that Paul Waugh, the government serving kind of website person, is saying today is that the government's apps for the tests, which is an Apple computer linked app, is incompatible with most people's equipment or devices because it needs an upgraded version of the Apple operating system, 13.2 or something. Most people are content with their previous kind of version of the operating system. So that is a significant kind of disconnect between what people have, what kind of devices people have, and what devices this app demands of them in order to access whatever the app that is supposedly on offer. So going back to the main theme, the main narrative in this diagnosis is this: no accountability. So the accountability, there is no culture of accountability, and the accountability is lacking in everything, which is why it seems there is no connection among the various parts of the operations, so-called, whatever they are. And it kind of translates into pandemonium. There is no, quote, understandable or as understood government or governance. If that is the case generally, in terms of the behavior of UK central government, then it is even worse and has been worse in the case of the UK local government, so-called. We shall go back to Newham in a minute, but talking about Tower Hamlets and talking about the anniversary this week of the mass evictions project that was mounted by the Royal London Hospital in 1987. Now, from 87 to now, it is 33 years, isn't it? And for 33 years, there have been evictions, programs, and projects by the likes of the Royal London Hospital, who are, of course, the kind of standard bearers of the slogan that they are the providers of the care and compassion to patients. But this is not patients. They were making otherwise well people, unill, people who are not ill were being made ill by the Royal London Hospital. Think about that. Royal London Hospital, which later, about 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years or 20 years let's say later, was featured endlessly in videos with its spokespersons appearing on television, spilling absolute rubbish about their fantastic work in saving lives and whatever, or caring for people, especially in the wake of or immediately after the explosion in Aldgate East, which is not far from Whitechapel. It's just the nearest hospital, main hospital, Whitechapel. So if that image is actually played against the actual record of their policies and practices as applied against local people, well people not ill. Remember that, people not ill, not suffering any effects of an explosion or anything like that. Ordinary people living in ordinary kind of houses and flats. The properties I'm talking about where properties owned, the freehold ownership was in the hands of the Royal London Hospital as the bureaucracy, as the kind of entity. So the Royal London Hospital had been controlling the freehold of the properties, but was not keeping the properties in good repair. And anyone viewing the previous kind of commentaries will know that the Tower Hamlets Council had an employee in the 1960s called Kemp. I think the name was Peter Kemp. It's spelled in the same way as Hitler's Mein Kampf. And the man was employed to harass the residents at an address in New Road in Stepney, which was owned by, or the freehold owned by at that time, because it had various owners, but at that time in the 60s, the ownership had been acquired by the Royal London Hospital. And the Royal London Hospital was behaving later or throughout the period with the active knowledge of Peter Kemp and whoever his other colleague or colleagues were in the local council, where they had the duty under the law to make sure that properties were in good state, good repair. Now this Peter Kemp was harassing the residents on the alleged ground of overcrowding. Now there was a culture of overcrowding, absolutely true. There was a culture of overcrowding right across the area in the 60s. They're talking about the 1960s. And the reason why there were properties, overcrowded conditions, simply to do with the fact that the local council had failed or neglected the duty to make sure that the people were living in decent, livable kind of properties. So remember, this is going back 40 years, more than 40 years. So the eviction, the ban on eviction proceedings that were so-called, imposed in March 2020 by Robert Jenrick, on the ground that people, if evicted, would be exposed to the virus and so on. So this eviction proceeding through the county courts was actually halted or banned, so-called, for few months. That ban has been removed, thus opening the floodgate of the eviction proceedings against people now. We're talking 40 years apart, but the Royal London Hospital was evicting people. Royal London Hospital. It wasn't like a typical landlord who was intent on degenerating, like the porn billionaire Richard Desmond, in relation to the site in Tower Hamlets on the Docklands in the so-called Isle of Dogs, West Ferry Road Printworks. That West Ferry Road Printworks is a reference to the printworks used to print newspapers, including the Daily Express, the Star, when they were owned by Dirty Desmond, Richard Desmond, the porn billionaire. And he also printed all his pornographic magazines, whatever. But that is now changed, and he wants to make it the site of a tall building containing expensive houses or flats that are totally closed to, not available to, not open for people who are less than who earn less than millions, or whose income was or is less than 500,000 pounds or something like that. So the recent changes in the regime in local councils accounting or auditing the role of the license applicants, like for permission, planning license or planning permission for constructing tall buildings or buildings housing, containing housing but not necessarily housing that is available or can be acquired by people in need, local people in need. So this is an extremely kind of high profile reference to a typical landlord. Okay, so that's the understandable. The criticism he has drawn are absolutely fact-based and correct and justified. But what is the image of a hospital? And not only an ordinary hospital, the Royal London Hospital, which is ritually praised for looking after the health of the East Enders, people in the East End. What is the role of that hospital management in relation to supporting social housing or social atmosphere for people in the local area? People on average are on standard low income in the Whitechapel area, in the vicinity of the Royal London Hospital, especially in the properties that the Royal London Hospital was in control of, in legal kind of interest, was maximum like freehold. So when that particular property collapsed, the ceiling collapsed in the property in September 1987, the first thing was that the affected tenants and occupants made a complaint to the Royal London Hospital and demanded that the Royal London Hospital repaired or put the property in safe repair immediately. That's one. Number two is that the people also contacted the local council. It's the same Tower Hamlets Council which has been making otherwise uncritically promoted claims that it is concerned about local people and local kind of contribution that Desmond owed the local council for this huge kind of housing project that was going to be built if the planning permission was given to his project at West Ferry Road Printworks. Now, the Tower Hamlets Council in 1987 was already engaged in harassing or neglecting people. The harassment that began in the 60s or was heightened during the 1960s and early 1970s, fronted by council's employee Peter Kemp. That council neglected the complaint about the collapsing ceiling that took place in September 1987 in New Road, Stepney. They ignored that, and they did not come on the record or go on the record as making any acknowledgement of the fact that it was dangerous, lethal, and life-threatening, this kind of disrepaired condition of the building. So that's Tower Hamlets Council neglecting a complaint. And that complaint should be now brought up to date in terms of the context and topicality about this woman who, June Harvey, the victim of the July 2020 crane collapse in London E3. The crane collapsed because Tower Hamlets Council had continued to fail to monitor the safety of construction and buildings, just as it had failed to monitor the safety of the construction of the building in the Baudet Road in 2018, where this young mother died from falling bricks from a building under construction. And as I have been having to mention, and the child, 5-year-old child Alexia, was killed due to direct negligence by Tower Hamlets Council, who had a structure with rotten kind of rotting tree branch trunk. So Tower Hamlets Council had been negligent for decades. And the negligence of Tower Hamlets Council was evident in its failure to deal with the absolutely legitimate and urgent complaint lodged against the Royal London Hospital by the persons occupying the property in New Road, which had a falling ceiling, nearly escaped 2 persons. That was September 1987. So September 1987, September 1997, September 2007, September 2017, and it is now September 2020. So it's 33 years. For 33 years, Tower Hamlets Council has neglected, because in the 33 years since the collapse of the ceiling, Tower Hamlets Council has not taken any action against the Royal London Hospital. And immediately after the complaint was made, following the collapse ceiling, the Royal London Hospital mounted a series of mass eviction programs against the people living in that particular property and also in other properties along the line, along the road, in New Road, in Stepney. So they actually targeted hundreds of people living there in New Road area. And they caused mass eviction in 1987, 33 years ago. So anyone who kind of reads the stuff in the papers, local paper, so-called East London Idiotizer and the Fleet Street, about ban on evictions being lifted and ban on evictions being linked to the possibility of people will be affected during this particular crisis, needs to understand that evictions have not been kind of used with any social responsibility, social concern, or any duty of care shown to the people affected by the evictions by the various agencies, including the likes of the National Health Service Organization, Royal London Hospital. Think about this. So when they went to kind of cheer the NHS workers at 8 p.m. for months, what kind of contextual location they had for people like that in the context of, in relation to the behavior of the management of the hospital that they are in towards the people generally. It follows that if the Royal London Hospital management could actually premeditatedly mount an attack to cause homelessness and cause people to lose their homes, with all the implications on their health, mental health, physical health, well-being, and on their properties, as far back as 33 years ago, and as they have been allowed to remain exempt from any accountability throughout the 33 years that followed. What kind of irresponsible, uncaring, cruel policies have the same hospital or the same kind of organization's management has been following since those years, and what similar contempt and cruelty and negligence and lack of care and violation of the rights of the targets have been being perpetrated by their counterparts and corresponding management personnel making the decisions in the name of the other NHS hospital entities. Think about that. And this is why it's very important to go beyond the headlines and look at the actual evidence. And the reason why the pandemic and the trace and track and kind of check and all these headlines, the headlines dominated by the evidence at every stage of incompetence, dysfunction, lack of care, and the propensity to blame the public, which is what Peter Walker, one of the Daily Boris Graph's former employees who knows about Boris Johnson and who routinely says that Boris Johnson has never been fit for public office, Peter Walker has said today that the private eye kind of pun or joke, so-called, this issue about nothing working is correct, but it's not correct just about one issue. It's about all the public service, so-called public service in quotation marks, public service agencies and outlets and in this country have remained and have never been have remained unaccountable to the public and unaccountable in public for the remit, for their duties to serve the public. So it includes the NHS hospitals, the management, and it includes the local councils, and it includes the various companies which in the pandemic kind of crisis, the companies have been forming and kind of being replaced by newer companies. And the only thing that they are not replacing or changing is the agenda to rob and loot the public and to remain unaccountable. So the question is, all of these fact and these facts is and are known to the people who edit, commission, research, and write most of this stuff in the media. So why don't they say what I'm saying? Why don't they ask questions about the actual behavior, the actual evidence? Why don't they do that? Because 99% of the headlines and the 99% of the copy in Fleet Street every day during the last, let's say 1 week when the latest about turn by Johnson began, and I'll come to the reason why I think why he has been staging this about turn and why the Fleet Street magazine media that wants him to stay in power has been lying for him. And that reason is when he tried to break the law about the Brexit agreement, he was found out. Of course, he had been found out ritually, serially before. But on this occasion, it was the starkest evidence of law-breaking propensities that Johnson had been involved in doing. Starkest evidence of law-breaking propensities that had been found in the behavior of Boris Johnson. So that's why he got a shock. Of course, nothing shocks him in the sense that he never stops being a liar. But this one shocked him because it was very clear that a large number of people who backed him as a liar before were finding it difficult to support his open, brazen breaking of the law. And that meant only one thing, that he would lose the support of the MPs in the House of Commons. And if that happened, he would be losing the spot at number 10 Downing Street. That is the reason, not because Boris Johnson cares about the health or safety of the people affected by the virus. That is why he had to shift, run fast away, as fast as possible, away from any Brexit-based profiteering and capitalizing and exploitation. Brexit has died. Brexit has not functioned, it has not worked, and it has not brought any control at all. So much so that even the Brexit kind of conceiver, self-styled, Nigel Farage, has run away from Brexit and is himself talking about the Boris Johnson-fronted government failing in the last 6 months. So that is the absolute truth about the lies that the media are kind of perpetrating by not telling their readers and their viewers these facts and these connections. They are not admitting that Brexit has failed, and Brexit has undone Boris Johnson so far already. And Boris Johnson knows that, so he is running fast, as fast as possible, from the mantra that he thought was kind of undefeatable and invincible, that Brexit was a positive thing all round. Now, Brexit has brought nothing but disaster to everything in terms of accountability, lack of accountability, lack of constitutionality, lack of rule of law, lack of basic decency and morality in public life in this country. And Brexit has given, Brexit has been used. Well, it has been abused. It has been an abuse, but that is what it has been kind of treated as a tool with which to hit anyone who supports accountability, who supports transparency, who supports democracy and the rule of law and the due process and all the rest of it. But this time, with the most brazen attempt to break the law and the rule of law and to show two fingers, Boris Johnson has been caught not only as dishonest, but also intellectually unfit. So he's running from Brexit and taking cover under the COVID kind of resurgence. And there is an imbroglio, because why has there been a resurgence? And the answer, I say, is because they've never told the truth about where the incidents are and how the thing actually spreads, how the thing spreads. These curfews and the other kind of time-related kind of stunts are not factual pointers to how the thing is contracted and how the thing actually spreads and how the thing actually works from A to Z, which is what I keep saying and I'll continue to say. And these other things, the trace and testing and vaccine, all of those things are collectively evidence of the lack of transparency. Because at no stage in any of the prescriptions that they are kind of issuing is there evidence of the contact of the virus and the spread of it and its conclusion. And they're not comparing with other jurisdictions or countries. I mean, today's example is Israel failing to stop it despite tougher measures. But similar failures and disconnections are absolutely rampant across the USA. And Boris Johnson is actually taking the lead from the swamp, Trump. And there is a series of, almost on a daily basis, actions, emergency steps, paraded as being genuine, but these are knee-jerk stunts that are absolutely intended to mislead people and lull people into a sense of feeling safe because there are these measures being taken. And then when it comes to the measures themselves, they are found to be not connecting. Like the device that Paul Waugh has been talking about, that the devices people have are pre the latest Apple set. So what they're doing is they're actually advertising for Apple computer, that buy the new upgrade, and it is worth billions. I mean, if people are forced to buy the new upgrade under pressure, emotional pressure and propaganda, that this will save the people from the virus, then the impetus is going to be incomparable with anything else. This impetus is going to cause a stampede. It's a mass stampede for people to buy the upgrade. And that is evidence of corruption at every stage in the whole thing. Apple computer is not transparent, nor is any of the giant kind of IT giant, whatever. And all of these big giants have already pocketed or trousered or acquired for themselves, one way or another, a deal with publicly kind of owned agencies or publicly accountable agencies that are not accountable to the public. And the maximum amount of the so-called special measures on emergency funding, publicly kind of legitimized, that money is going to these big companies, not to the ordinary people. And going back to the Royal London Hospital, most of the ordinary workers and staff are not paid the big amounts of money. And the executives and the consultants are the ones who pocket the main share. Union's attitude and the people who are at the lowest kind of ranks in the NHS and the lowest paid, they are not being educated to stop being prejudiced and biased and racist. Because racism has killed all these people in the care homes and all the other people that have, because there has been a withdrawal of the full, unbiased, dedicated support and treatment of most of the people, which is what has happened. And they will never admit to this because that would be exposing their own kind of deadly role. And no media, none of the media which has given lists of pictures and others of the victims of the virus, victims from so-called BAME communities, has gone to the reason. Is there a bias? Is there a traceable, identifiable kind of racist factor? Racist being prejudiced against a particular patient and neglecting them. Any study of the NHS will show that racism is the main problem within the NHS, but they don't admit it. And when the Royal London Hospital took a non-medical, non-clinical, racist decision to cause mass evictions, mass losses of homes in 1987, following the collapse of the ceiling in New Road in September 1987. The Royal London Hospital made the decision racistly because the people, most of the people, the absolute majority of the people living in the properties affected would be low income and would be Asian mainly. So that is absolutely true today as it has been the last 33 years. So when the evictions proceedings are lifted, the ban on eviction proceedings in county courts or through county courts are lifted, the factor that needs to be examined is to what extent are the judges, mostly deputy district judges or district judges, to what extent is their racism affecting their decisions at every stage, because there is access to a say and there is the permission to say a particular thing during the proceedings. And the same should apply to the licensed law traders who still are able to acquire kind of clientele to so-called apparently appear in the name of the clients, not on behalf of. I say in the name of. There is a very significant difference. In the name of means it's not what they are doing necessarily, but exploiting. So for example, when we say the Tower Hamlets Council has various employees in place in the name of looking at building security, looking at the relevance of the planning audit that it supposedly runs in the name of the local community or electors. I mean exactly that the council is not doing what it is supposed to do. And that is the reason why so many people are endangered with losing their lives, losing their livelihoods, and losing their kind of community. For example, in the campaign, still incomplete campaign, to stop the criminal gangsters of Proplaharka destroying the community component of the Christian market. The collusion and the conspiracy between the Tower Hamlets Council and the criminals of Proplaharka is identical with the similar kind of comparable conspiracy and plots and collusions Tower Hamlets Council has been operating with the Royal London Hospital and the criminals who made the decision in the name of the Royal London Hospital to cause mass evictions to the people living in the properties in Stepney in 1987. And what happened was that there was no comeback. There was no issue raised by any of the councillors who were in place at the time, any of the councillors in 1987. And the councillors in Tower Hamlets just happened to be SDP liberal ones, because they had just got in 1986 for the first time as a single group in control of the council. And it didn't change the attitude and the racism and the hostility and the culture of negligence and culture of cruelty and the culture of lack of care to the community as exhibited in the behavior of the Tower Hamlets Council's various employees in various positions relating to so-called social service, relating to so-called control on the buildings, relating to so-called control on the planning regime. So what happened during the 4 years that the Lib Dems, now called Lib Dem, but then they were called SDP Liberals, were in, quote, control of the Tower Hamlets Council, nothing changed for the better. And there was no accountability delivered to the people affected by the Royal London Hospital mass eviction. And there were literally hundreds of written communications sent to the Tower Hamlets Council about the behavior of Royal London Hospital. But there was no response, let alone any action by the Lib Dem, SDP liberal kind of outfit that was in control of the Tower Hamlets Council. In fact, it was 1987, the same year, that one of the numbers of the Lib Dem in control of Tower Hamlets Council since the council election of 1986, which they won for the first time in their whole history. In 1987, the same group declared that the housing problem faced by people in Tower Hamlets, and we'll come to the kind of ethnic targeting of that, could be significantly reduced if the people were willing to be housed on boats. Now that was the thing that happened before the September collapse of the ceiling in New Road in 1987. So I campaigned against the Lib Dems in 1987, declaring that the homeless people should be housed in boats. There were other matters of detail about the various aspects of the implications of the impact on the lives of people and families. But the biggest damage that the Tower Hamlets Council caused in 1987 by colluding with Royal London Hospital, attacking the residents in the properties owned by Royal London Hospital, was to the projects that had been built for decades already. Original research, original campaign action, original writing projects, original composition projects, original recording, investigative reporting projects, and educational projects that were based in the property, which was affected by the collapsed ceiling. And that is where the maximum damage was caused, and that damage has been accelerating and building up and being kind of mounting every single minute since that happened in 1987. And in there, I have just added the role of the Tar Hamlets Council, colluding, conspiring, and aggravating their response and violation of the denial. The denial of the duty of care as owed to the people affected by the, first of all, the collapsed ceiling, and by the history of negligence by the Royal London Hospital prior to the collapsed ceiling, and the collusion since the collapsed ceiling. So this is Tar Hamlets Council colluding with the Royal London Hospital's criminals, criminally negligent and racistly motivated management. Yesterday, I mentioned Brendan O'Sullivan. Brendan O'Sullivan was a housing sector kind of worker, an activist, who for a number of years was employed by the then Spitalfields Housing Cooperative. And it was in September, around the time of the ceiling collapse, just before, probably the 14th or 15th or 16th of September, maybe a week before the ceiling collapse, that I was walking through Brick Lane and I came to bump into Brendan O'Sullivan at a spot not far from 170 Brick Lane. And that conversation was about the role being played at that time in the context of the high demands and needs for housing by the housing co-op, Spitalfields Housing Co-op, that I had campaigned to set up. I had been campaigning. I had not been a member of the committee that was formed later. But in the years before, I had been at the forefront of the campaign for housing solution, social housing solution, council housing solution for the community, for the people that were most affected. While I was doing that, I was also living at a property owned by the Royal London Hospital. I was paying the rent, but the official name was of a member of the family, let's say. So all the work that I was doing was summarized in that conversation by Brendan O'Sullivan, expressing a statement, brief statement, in which he acknowledged the work that I had been doing. So on that basis, he actually offered, as an employee of the then Spitalfield Housing Cooperative, he offered me the use of the photocopying machine of that organization to copy publications and leaflets, and the title was the Odhikar Weekly, that was dedicated to campaigning for the community. He understood the need for resource, and that is what he offered. So that was the beginning of the contacts and the communication. While we had been just entering into the kind of activities that was agreed there based on his offer and invitation, the ceiling collapsed. So Brendan O'Sullivan became very immediately kind of aware, immediately after the collapse of the ceiling in New Road. So he wrote a letter to the Royal London Hospital and requested them to allow the time for the purchase of the property by another organization. The Royal London Hospital did not agree to drop their attack on causing the occupants to become homeless. So that's the kind of beginning of their attack in terms of the duties that they were flouting following the collapse of the ceiling, which was the really significant milestone, because until that collapse happened, all the buildings were in need of one kind of repair or another. But there was no significant incident like that collapsed roof ceiling. So therefore, nothing could be mentioned as a physical action, physical effect of the disrepair in that way, in that kind of serious way. Yet when this serious effect happened, any reasonable, quote, owner of the freehold would be expected to take that as a very serious departure from their duties. And the local council would be equally expected to look at that as a serious breach of the duty. They didn't. Tower Hamlets Council refused to engage and refused to admit anything wrong had been done. And instead, Tower Hamlets Council separately refused to provide housing, alternative housing, to the people who have been being evicted or being caused eviction attacks by the Royal London Hospital. So the Liberals in place already in Tower Hamlets Council were as dishonest as the Royal London Hospital crooks in 1987, as Tower Hamlets Council crooks have been in denial about Chris Street Market in 2018, as have been the crooks in the gangsters organization Popla Harka. The gangsters organization was given thousands of council properties as part of John Prescott's fronted attack on councils owning thousands of council properties during 2004 and 2006. These are significant evidential items of information exclusively brought to whoever is viewing this, whenever they're viewing this, coming from the Khudilar campaign, defending the community in the East End of London. And it shows how far ahead we have been in the battle against attacks by evictions. Decades. Throughout the last 33 years, our campaign has been at the receiving end of dozens of eviction attacks. Dozens of evictions attack mounted by sets of criminals with no basis on the facts of our conduct. So evictions have been imposed repeatedly by criminals, serial criminals, and the criminals are named in a recap here, include criminals Colin Cormack, criminal Steve Hill, criminal Mike Tyrrell, and assorted other criminals, including a criminal called Carol Thomas, and the criminal licensed law trader called Edward Fitzpatrick of Garden Court Chambers, cited in the Lincoln's Inn in London, and the infant criminal licensed law trader solicitor Lucy Green, spelled with a E at the end, and assorted other criminals. So anyone who says that they can go outside the Stratford Magistrate Court or County Court and stage a mock trial of something about eviction proceedings being revived needs to know that evictions are not a new invention in the sense of the revived kind of regime of evictions, but the evictions have been used as a key and a central tool to create homelessness, mass homelessness to be created in areas like Tower Hamlets. In the same borough which has been given positive mentions by the Inside Housing and other idiots, when they were misreporting on the so-called behavior of the porn billionaire Richard Desmond, who bribed the conservatives through his donations in order to get Robert Jenrick to change his kind of status, that is the applicant status as an applicant to the local council, Tower Hamlets Council, for planning permission to build this big complex of housing, expensive housing for the rich at the West Ferry Road Printworks. So these are the very detailed kind of facts that show that eviction is used in order to deliberately create homelessness. And the local councils are not doing their job of telling the truth at any level. So these last week's statements by Roxana Fiaz of Newham Council, the elected mayor, so-called, at the name, at the expense of Newham Council in East London, a Labour Party stronghold, she boasted on the 12th of March 2018. Roxana Fiaz expressing bogus concern at the dangerous effects of lifting the ban on evictions has to be seen in the context of her own record of lying and collusion. And Roxana Fiaz has been covering up for the in-house criminals and racists and liars who have been robbing bona fide applicants for local housing allowance of their legally claimed, lawfully claimed, legally payable local housing allowance. And the editorial by The Guardian this week, the Guardian position or the Guardian view on the ending of the ban on evictions, on council, on eviction proceedings in the courts, is ignorant, misinformed, and based on shallow familiarity with the facts on the ground. No publication, no Fleet Street paper, no BBC item, no Sky, nothing. Not a single part of the media has any clue as to what is going on. And I say that by what is going on, I mean that housing crisis is created as part of a planned strategy. Evictions are intentionally used as a tool to intentionally create homelessness. Eviction is not, in the majority of the cases, related to a kind of struggling landlord, as they say, trying to make ends meet or get some money or get some income. That is not the case. And the fact that evictions are granted in the large numbers that the evictions are granted in this country by the rubber stamping courts is directly to do with the criminals who are allowed to sit as judges. I referred to the criminal called Sullivan. I named the criminal Sullivan, who sat as a deputy district judge in August 2015 at the county court in Stratford in Romford Road. Because that liar spewed a string of words in praise of the Tower Hamlets Council's thugs who were harassing members of a small cooperative, 3 people, 3 men, including a man in his 80s, Mr. Ray. And this Sullivan, totally without any fact, any evidence, nothing to do with any knowledge on how corrupt the Tower Hamlets Council had been for decades. He praised that same council. And he said that Tower Hamlets Council had been struggling with all its best intentions to help people in housing crisis, housing shortage. And that there was a long waiting list and all the rest of it. Absolute lies. All the waiting lists and the other things were created by Tower Hamlets Council over decades of deliberate plan. So anyone who talks about evictions needs to know these facts. Anyone who reports about this needs to know these facts on the ground, that evictions have always been available as a tool, and the courts have been abused by these ignorant and racist and corrupt judges who have gone out of their way to attack the victims of evictions. It happened in Stratford County Court at that time in August 2015, and it has been happening in Shoreditch County Court, and it has been happening in Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court since it became merged with Shoreditch, or since Shoreditch was kind of allowed to be merged with Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. Same thing happened in the Central London County Court. The Central London County Court has been now shifted in terms of from the previous location to the site in the Strand, in the complex of the Royal Courts of Justice. This is the word justice that I use as a quotation, not because I have any evidence to call this structure anything to do with justice. Because most of the times the rulings are just rubber stamping the status quo, most of the times. And the other thing is that most of the access given to the kind of operations of the courts, most of the access is only available to those who are wealthy, regardless of how deep their criminality is and how deep their robbery of other people's properties and belongings is. Anyone who can show that they are wealthy can hire any number of licensed law traders to peddle their lying line and get rubber stamped as a court ruling in their favor. That is the role of the whole Royal Courts of Justice kind of units of judiciary. And when the Central London County Court was reportedly kind of hearing the case of one woman from Newham, Sarah Abdullah, it was reported as having expressed serious concern about the behavior of Newham Council. That was absolutely rare. Absolutely rare. The Central London County Court did not, in the long number of years that it had been in kind of business of rubber stamping, expressed any sympathy for the victims of council cruelty. And a deputy district judge called in the Central London County Court, who was involved in hearing a case that I brought against the London Borough of Tower Hamlets Council. He was openly an idiot, and I called him an idiot to his face in the hearing. And there were about 10 Tower Hamlets Council employee crooks sitting behind me, against me, of course. And that deputy district judge was a complete, utter, absolute idiot, because I gave him the constitutional law duties. He had to hear my claim, and he didn't hear my claim. He preferred the plastic utterances perpetrated there by an African origin woman on behalf of the racist criminals in control of Tower Hamlets Council's racist and criminal behavior, to do with housing, do with a series of eviction notices that they had kind of foisted on me for no reason. So there is no evidence, 33 years now, there has been no evidence of anything wrong that any of the occupants in the properties owned by the Royal London Hospital had done. No, nothing. We had done nothing wrong. And in the 33 years since then, I have not done anything wrong, and there has been no evidence of me doing anything wrong or negligent. And yet I have been at the receiving end of dozens of eviction attacks. So anyone who says that the evictions are only starting now doesn't know the evidence that I have been dealing with and encountering for 33 years. So we shall be, of course, talking more about this for the simple reason that this is the most urgent social implication on the lives of people and on the lives and the quality of society that we are facing, because there is no accountability. The point is, there is no accountability at any stage. The police don't do anything against criminals behaving criminally. It's not because of any absence of evidence. When the gang of criminals operating from the Spitalfields Small Business Association were mounting their version of the attack on the archives and the original works in July 2012 to October 2012, one metropolitan policeman that I gave the information to said that I was being evicted. Now remember that. Eviction, even when it is rubber stamped, has to be done after a court process. There was no court process. These thugs and criminals, about 5 or 6 of them, were hired by the criminals at the Spitalfield Small Business Association, and they came and took the stuff away. And in that, as a colluder, was the Tower Hamlets Council, of course, fronted by Lutfur Rahman. And it was happening at a location between 160 and 170 Brick Lane, London E1 6RU, which is where I filmed Lutfur Rahman a year earlier in February 2011, walking with a criminal, Aziz Chowdhury, and the co-criminal, Aman Dalby of the council, to the waiting taxi. February the 15th, 2011. So I had told Lutfur Rahman of the ongoing criminality being done by Tower Hamlets Council employees, and Lutfur Rahman kept lying. So it's the elected mayor at the expense of the community in Tower Hamlets. And the expense is literally applicable to what happened. He never did anything, and he never took any action against the criminals in the council. In fact, Lutfur Rahman was colluding with the criminals, as was Aman Dalby. And the criminals were fronted by, at that time in the contracts, on behalf or in the name of the Spitalfields Housing Small Business Association, by the criminal called Aziz Chowdhury.